All right, well, welcome everybody to this Zoom discussion of 10 years of the National Pavilion. It was a discussion that was meant to be at Art Dubai, but because of the coronavirus, we have gone digital and we are recording it on Zoom. And hopefully in the future, we'll pick it up in Al Serkal Avenue or in the flesh somewhere else. But it is a great way to discuss what the impact of the National Pavilion has been now that it's 10 years into its tenure. So I'm delighted to be joined with Myrna Ayad, who is a lapsed critic, someone who's given up the art writing ghost, was the editor of Canvas for a long time, and then was a director of Art Dubai for 2 years, and is now working on a number of different projects, including consulting in the UAE, and grew up in the UAE, grew up in Dubai. And Munira Al Sayegh, who is from Abu Dhabi, or joining us from Abu Dhabi and is from Abu Dhabi, who is a former intern on Mohammed Kazem's 2011 participation in the UAE National Pavilion, and is now a curator of many hats, always doing things in various places across the UAE, but is currently working on a project for the Dubai Expo 2020, and is wrapping up a huge project with Hashal Alamki, who's a really interesting painter and artist, a young artist from Abu Dhabi. And that's going to go online soon from Warehouse 421, if that's right. So we can look at that too. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to move our thoughts from coronavirus to the meeting point for the art world of the Venice Biennale, which is also an interesting case study in the UAE context, because it's an amazing negotiation between the national and the international. And it's something, the national is something that the UAE has a particular relationship to, because it's still very much 7 Emirates with different art scenes. And the National Pavilion is the one body that transcends all 7 of them. And, you know, as someone who's more of an external observer of the UAE, having come later to it, it's definitely a launching pad for the national scenes of the UAE to an international stepping stone, international vista. So that's so it's interesting to think at this 10-year point, how has it impacted the international profile of the UAE, but perhaps more interestingly and more importantly, how has it impacted the national scene back home? And I think that's what we kind of want to focus on in this talk. And it's great to have 2 people who know the UAE so well and have been so invested in building up the UAE scene to discuss it with me. But Myrna, can I start with you and maybe to ask you to set the scene for 2009? What was it like for the first participation? What was the feeling of the importance of participating on that international stage? Because, you know, 2009 was also the point of the Saadiyat Museum's projects being announced. It was a moment when the UAE decided to step up its development of art, and it kind of seemed like it understood that stepping up of development of art as synonymous with bringing it to an international platform. So can you talk about what that moment was like internationally, but also what it was like nationally or locally back home?
Thanks, Melissa. You know, I was just doing the math real quick, and that was 11 years ago. And that might seem like a small number, but I feel like we've done so much, you know, in that time. If I'm not mistaken, Saadiyat, or the projects for Saadiyat Ireland were announced in 2007. And that was the same year that both Art Dubai and the then called Art Paris Abu Dhabi were launched. So Art Dubai in March, and then Art Paris Abu Dhabi for a couple of years before it became Abu Dhabi Art in November. I remember when people would talk about Venice Biennale, it seemed, and I don't want to sound cliche, but it seemed unachievable. Like you know, it was, you know, you had to do a lot, and then you had to prove a lot, you know, to get there. And then when it happened, it was so exciting. And so everybody felt such an amazing sense of pride. We all went, everybody was there. And if you recall, we had Lamis Hamdan at the time, who was the commissioner, and she had gone to Venice, I think, in the 2 years before, and she'd gone and come back and told the then UAE Minister of Culture, Abdurrahman Al-Awais, that we need to be there. And so we all understood that this was the Olympics of the art world. Like, you show in Venice and, you know, you've kind of made it in a sense. It was so new, Melissa. It was so new. It was my first time ever in Venice, and then also at the Biennale. It was so overwhelming, but then you felt the seriousness of it. You felt the weight of history of this. And then in subsequent years, every time you asked an Emirati artist, what was your aspiration? They would say, to show in Venice. And I bet they still say that, you know, it just became up here, you know, the thing that they all aspire to. And then, of course, as the years went by, it was just so exciting to know, okay, so who's the curator? And, you know, what artists are they going to show? And, you know, what's the presentation? And then you felt, oh, something is being seriously grounded here when the Sheikh Salama Foundation took over, became the commissioner, and then secured 20 years of, you know, the UAE's participation. It was around this time I was working at Canvas, and you wanted to know, as a writer who wrote about, you know, still writes about art from the Middle East and the Arab world, where were the Arabs? And where was the Middle East really, you know, in something as old as Venice? And we came to know that actually Egypt was given a pavilion in the 1950s, and Iran had a few, you know, participations, but things really started for the region in the 2000s, you know, in 2009 onwards.
That idea of setting up kind of a regional art scene, or understanding the ways in which the UAE is relates to the, you know, the art scenes, say in Abu Dhabi, relate to the scenes in Dubai and Sharjah, and then also relate to what's happening in Bahrain, what's happening in Jeddah, and then to a larger extent what happens in Lebanon, and then to a larger extent what happens in the West. That kind of like Russian doll mapping of a scene, Munira, is something that you've done, you know, in various projects, isn't it? I remember you did that amazing talk series at Abu Dhabi Art, and you invited so many participants from the Khaliji network that hadn't really been brought, amazingly actually hadn't been brought in one space to speak to each other. And then that's something I think you're, you know, continuing with your current projects for Art Dubai. Can you talk a little bit about the way you know, the UAE exists as a national framework, but also this question that Myrna raised about, you know, where are the Arabs in Venice Biennale, and what's the importance of having an Arab representation, and also what do we mean when we say Arab representation?
I think what's interesting is to begin to understand the spectrum that exists in the UAE. And as Myrna said, we started with Venice, you know, like formally, the beginning was Venice. So the question becomes what already exists on the ground, and how do we bind the spectrum? Like, how do we bring it all together? And so that became a very big fascination for me, especially as I was working with the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project. I began to wonder that, you know, what is the role of these big scale institutions on the ground? Like, how are they impacting, and what is the ripple effect? What does that look like? And I think the UAE began to formalize art through art fairs. I mean, Art Dubai was a major catalyst for artists and creatives alike. The question becomes, what is that gap that exists? And that gap is what has begun to take place organically. You know, what can we look at on an organic scale, and how can we begin to understand what the language of the Gulf is when it comes to creatives and artists and curators. So I started to kind of explore this notion through the 2017 talks program at Abu Dhabi Art, and what I began to find out was that there's this a very interesting and unique sort of regional voice that is upcoming, and then for me the question then became, how do we take that voice and elevate it to a level where when you look into the Gulf, you look into a Gulf that has a voice that is unique, that is also really actively participating in the present with regards to discussions that are taking place or changes that are affecting us on a day-to-day basis, and then how we can plug that into a bigger frame. How does that plug into Venice? How does that plug into other larger creative meeting points in the world? And I think it's very healthy to think of things from the bottom up, but the structure that we've been given is almost top down. It feels a little bit harsh to say, but we started with the best. We started with the biggest, and so how do we now make the biggest and the best for us as people in the art scene? How do we represent ourselves at a level that is international, if the local and regional level is still we're still kind of weaving everything together, so it's very interesting for me, because my exposure to Venice was as an intern. And I was there for a month, and I got to know Mohammed Kadhim's work, and I was prior to that an intern in New York at the Guggenheim, where I met Reem Fadda, who was the curator for that pavilion, and that dialogue I will never forget that I had with her. I mean, I'm an art history student, and when I moved from London to New York, I met Reem, and she just really began to teach me a lot about the contemporary art scene that I had no idea about, and so coming back to the UAE with that information and going to Venice and seeing what Venice can do for an artist and for the local art scene became very interesting for me. Like, how do you tag something that happens internationally back to what's going on locally?
It is interesting, because the UAE art scene is kind of built of contradictions. I mean, you have this, top-down framework, and then you also have the bottom-up framework, and you have these, the National Pavilion as I said before, like this national scene that, that as an umbrella body for a national scene that almost doesn't exist. You do have kind of different pockets. And as I was looking at over the history of the last 10 years, it seems to be a pattern where you have these amazing curators. I mean, they've worked with great curators, like not just Reem Fadda, but also Vasif Kortoon, Tirdad Zolgar for the first 2009 participation, Sam Bardou and Til Felrath last year. But it's often an outsider curator, a curator who's not Emirati or not based in the Emirates, who kind of negotiates this participation in this representation of a UAE artist. And I mean, that's an interesting pattern. I don't know quite where we want to take that, but as you're talking about this idea of a Gulf voice or a UAE voice, I wonder, in the many different iterations of the UAE pavilion, do you feel like that Gulf voice has been represented each year, or the diversity has been represented, or has yeah, go ahead.
I think that I think Hoor's exhibition was monumental in many ways, because she was really showcasing what has existed, sort of to quieten the voices that say there is no art in the UAE, and there's never been art in the UAE until they found oil, or whatever the case is, So for me, that was, it was more of an academic exhibition, and I really enjoyed that. And I think the UAE is that pairing, between people coming into the UAE and understanding it, and leaving the UAE with what they've taken, and the local scene, or the people who are here locally have always sort of welcome people coming in, of course, and that language is very much what makes the UAE as unique as it is. So I think that's interesting, but I do hope in the future with with curators that have been in the UAE and with their growth, that there's going to be that dialogue, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you imagine some of the artists that existed, say from the pioneering artists, it would be very interesting to have somebody that's like very much here and with them almost all the time, because the more time you spend with them, the more you will receive, so
Mira, is this your pitch to be the Venice Biennale curator for
me
2021? It would be so great to have someone.
not yet. I definitely don't think I'm there yet, but I just think it's very humbling to grow with artists. Like I think of Hashil, and I think of his future, and I think of sort of that relationship that I have with him, for example, and how that could grow into something, say 15, 20 years down the line, for Venice, let's say. But that's you will arrive to a show or an exhibition at the Pavilion that is very different, because it's more personal. You have that personal angle, and that's when I think that my personal belief is that's when the truth arrives within the voice that you're trying to showcase.
I've always thought it was interesting that the pavilions began with Lamia Gargash, in 2009, with these, like, you'd think for the first participation, especially for a country like the UAE, which, kind of starts at the best, you think you'd have these monumental works, but the works actually had such a beautiful domesticity and, a femininity. They were really like, I've always thought it was a really beautiful way to begin this relationship on the world stage. But I want to pick up on what you said about this idea of the horrors exhibition and this idea of the historical role that the National Pavilion has played, because that's, there hasn't been, there actually, for all this kind of top-down framework, a lot of the interesting things are kind of coming up through self-organized spaces, and there hasn't been an overarching national museum that tells the history of progression of UAE art. And in many ways, that role has been picked up by the National Pavilion. Myrna, is that something that you could talk about? Because you've witnessed and you've written about, and you've been the chronicler of, especially in your, the days at Canvas and the early days of kind of Art Dubai, when you talked about this transition from this 5, Hassan Sharif and the Flying House to this Art Dubai moment, which is something that the National Pavilion has been able to, refer back to kind of that whole breadth of that development. Could you talk about this historical role?
When I think back, I think we did things in a strange order. 2006 was the first Christie's auction in Dubai in May. 2007, as I mentioned, in March was Art Dubai, and then the same year Abu Dhabi Art. At that time, we didn't have as many galleries as we do now. We didn't have a museum. The commercial aspect of art sort of came first. We had the auctions, and then the art fairs, and then we had the pavilion, and then we had the museums, the foundations, more galleries, Al Sirkal, and so on and so forth. So our progression was kind of strange. It seems like it took on sort of like the parallel theme of the pavilion as well, because it was only somewhere midway where we had Hood curating a sort of retrospective, or at least a moment to explain to audiences that, wait a second, we actually do have, a history that's not tied to, the discovery of oil or petrodollars, but we had, quite an exciting period of, ambitious artists, including Hassan Sharif, Nujum Al-Ghanem, even Muhammad Qadim, working together to create, an art scene. And on the subject of, I just wanted to quickly point out it's true what Munira said. We started, with the best. Maybe that's the way we do things. I don't know. But that best then gave birth to an internship program. And that internship program is actually working towards the future. And I would not at all be surprised. In fact, I'm looking forward to it, for the day that they say Munira Al Sayegh is curating the UAE Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. It sounds like a natural progression. Should the Sheikh Hassan Foundation put together this internship program, as they did other initiatives, to incubate, to nurture, and to develop the talents of the UAE community. So Munira is definitely one example. One of the things that I also wanted to quickly point out is the painting behind Munira is a work by Muhammad Al-Mazroui. And who's an Emirati Egyptian artist. And the last time that I saw his work was at the Emirati Expressions exhibition in 2013.
That was later, I think 20, maybe it was November
2013. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure it's November 2013, and that was a show curated by Reem Fadda. And I'm biased about her. I've loved every single one of her exhibitions. I've loved the way that she tells the story. And there were people, but because it's a reflection of the UAE is so multicultural. So there were non-Emiratis watching and recording and interacting and engaging. And Reem was one of them. As were Sam Bardawil and Til Felrath. Sam actually lived in Dubai, for a period of time, and he taught at AUD. Vasif was coming in and out, quite a bit. Tirdad as well. I think he curated a couple of shows at the Third Line. So there was, all these curators that we had gathered had a lot of interaction with our, protagonists.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's kind of where I was going, is that the idea of the diversity again of the UAE is that it is a place where people come in and interact with the art scene and then leave and come back and leave and come back. It has this, it's a port city in many ways. I mean, Dubai is a port city, but the UAE is in some ways a port nation, and it brings so many people in and through. So that's what I think is, I think you can point to Hamad Nasser's pavilion for the UAE National Pavilion as the first to bring in non-local artists or artists who are living in the UAE but aren't Emirati. But I think what was so interesting to me in looking back over all the pavilions going back to 2009 is that you had that internationalism from the beginning. Even if it wasn't in the represented artists, you had it in the curators who were kind of negotiating that relationship, which is really I hadn't really thought of it like that before.
Also, historically, something that's important is that there was always this search for the outside to come in to sort of infiltrate that scene. Even when you think of the pioneering artists, there was always that. They had one of their friends and fellow artists that was working with them was from India, and then they had a friend from Germany, I believe, who really sort of came in and became a part of this family. And so I think that this is within the nature of the UAE. I mean, my exposure to contemporary art in the UAE started in New York from my meeting of Reem Fadda. So I think it's key, it's a very key point that makes us who we are, so that dialogue is, I think, essential to the art scene in the UAE.
But Mohammed Al-Mazroui, I mean, he is his works, because I last saw them at the Cultural Foundation, which actually Reem Fadda is now the director of, but it wasn't her show, it was the Maya Allison's show. I mean, they are just incredible, incredible, beautiful paintings, just so full of life. I guess we've gotten off topic, but I can't let an opportunity to say how much his work is amazing go by.
Munira, are you getting the subliminal messages?
Yes.
Take a note, guys.
We're watching you.
So the National Pavilion has 10 years left on its long-term agreement, and they have just.
No, I'm sure they're going to renew for sure.
But what do you feel like the impact now in 2020 of the weirdest of all years 2020 has been? So maybe not exactly the impact in this weird coronavirus, but more generally, where do you feel the National Pavilion fits in the local day-to-day runnings of the art scene, and how do you think it's, especially for you, Myrna, how has it shifted from that initial 2009 participation when, I think now that novelty, thankfully has worn off. Like it seems an accepted fact that the UAE would have participation in the pavilion, in the Venice Biennale. But how do you think it's shifted from the standpoint of now?
Just to quickly talk on Corona, because I don't want to talk about it at all anymore. But in my head, I'm just going to write it off, as the year that never happened. And so I look forward to the iterations at the Venice Biennale from next year, hopefully, or if by some miracle we can see the shows in August as the Venice Biennale had initially stated. I think for me personally, the real interest is in the content, and I think every year it gets harder for the pavilion to appoint a curator and to spotlight an artist or artists. I'll tell you why it gets harder, because you have 10 years behind you, okay? You have a theme to subscribe to, and you have a small pool of artists. And you really want to reflect the nation and the nation's beliefs and its ethos. So you really need the right kind of message. And so for me, I'm always so interested. Sorry, it's just a little disclaimer. I sit on the committee, so it's always so much fun to get these proposals. I love reading them. It tells me what others are thinking. Why they think this proposal for an exhibition is relevant. So it kind of tells you what people are thinking. Of course, we all have some idea of who should be shown and how they should be shown, but there is a science to curating that only curators master. And for me, it's a game of comparison, and then looking at the strengths and looking at the weaknesses. How did you engage the space? That's what I look forward to the most. So what we might be talking and hoping that Munira does eventually curate a pavilion at the Venice Biennale with Mohammed Al Mazrou'i. But just right now, I was thinking, Mohammed Al Mazrou'i's work is quite diverse, and alongside the works behind, Munira, there were some naughty ones. Naughty as in they were quite, political. They were quite charged. They were quite sensual. So I would look forward to seeing that, for example, at a national pavilion of the UAE, one day.
And Munira, how do you feel as someone who, kind of has, in a sense, grown up with the National Pavilion, as you were saying, kind of helped launch your career. How do you feel it sits now in terms of the many art scenes or the one art scene of the UAE?
I think that it's a definite catalyst and an anchor at the same time for the art scene here in the UAE, and I think that we all have sort of come a long way, and it's just very interesting to see the progression, because somehow the curator artist sort of bond becomes tighter and tighter every year. So and it's just that sort of the way that learning curve affects us here in the UAE in general is very interesting. You see what happens to an artist afterwards, seeing Mohammed Kadhim after Venice, or seeing Nujum Al Ghanem after Venice, and just how that just shifts so much of their being, and it's so interesting because it also makes all of these artists accessible, because prior to that there was not that sort of access, unless you knew somebody who knew somebody that could get you into that circle. So I'm very, very keen to see how it's going to progress, and also how the different hats of the UAE is going to be shown, like, on a national level. As Myrna was saying, you have artists who provoke deeper thought and questions, and like Mohammed Mazmouri, or also looking at Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim, for example, and beginning to understand the importance of landscape, away from the built landscape. It's ideal for someone like Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim to be in Venice, because you begin to see, that alternative understanding of what the UAE is, outside of the tall buildings, and what it's known for technically.
Yeah,
Melissa,
and
I want to ask you a question.
wait, let me just say one thing, and then you can get in there. I was just going to say, bringing up Najm Al-Ghanem, I mean, I think one thing we haven't discussed is the fact that it's such, it's a commission, and you're able, what Najm created for the last pavilion was such a step change, and such a different kind of work than she's ever made before. I mean, that was such an opportunity for her as an artist to grow her practice and to work with Sam and Till in that way. I mean, to be paired with these, these international curators. So I feel like that the commissioning aspect of the National Pavilion should be flagged in some sense. But come on, lapsed critic, ask away.
Okay, Melissa, you mentioned earlier that you had attended 2009.
I did, yeah.
And that was called, don't say, hold on. I'll forget it. It's something not. Anyway. Oh God. Anyway, what I wanted to know is, for you, you've seen it, 2009. I'm sure you've seen other iterations over the years. What do you hope to see next? And what's your take on what you've seen so far?
I mean, I think it's been a really, I've mentioned the word diversity, like I feel like that's been my talking point, but that wasn't really something I thought of before we even started Zooming. But it was interesting to me to look back and see how many different forms of representation or ways of representation the Pavilion has taken on, because there've been 6 iterations, but they've done, like, Lamia Gargesh was, and looking at Hamad Nasser, like those, or part of Hamad, were so contemporary, looking at contemporary artists who are working. And then there's, it's been the more historical, or the very overtly historical, like Hor Al Qasimi's, and then kind of looking at like a more recent historical with Muhammad Kazem, or someone who's kind of more tied to a history than this international contemporary or conceptual idiom. So it's been interesting to me to think about all the different, it's not like the UAE National Pavilion has had one angle on the UAE that it wanted to represent. I think sometimes it's been a surprise each year, and cumulatively, like in retrospect, it's kind of built up to quite an accurate representation of all the different hats, as Munira said, that the UAE art scene comprises. So that's been like and with the international aspect, that's been interesting to me. I think I've lost your question. What was your question?
No, I wanted to, well, first of all, I remember the name of the first pavilion. It was called It's Not You, It's Me.
Oh yeah, that's right, yeah.
And I still have the tote bag. I wanted to know what you hope to see.
Or what I hope to see. I really hope to see more. I mean, I genuinely hope to see Mohammed Al Masri. I also hope to see I'm blanking on the name, Al Ramathi, who he was paired with in that Maya Allison show. And so I thought a lot of that, like the work that the Cultural Foundation is doing now to find, the histories that, the hidden histories. I think that is supposed to be the one of the taglines for the National Pavilion. I'd like to see that. Like, I'd like to see more. And I think this kind of Emirati voice or Khaliji voice is an interesting framework. I mean, I think, what is coming late to the UAE, what made me most excited was about when artists were not interested in this kind of international conceptual, this language that kind of can exist anywhere and not at all. And I think finding artists like Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim are influenced by the land, or Abdullah Al Sadi, or Meitha Abdullah, who are kind of coming in that tradition of folk tales and, almost the micro local, I think. So that if I could see more of that, but that's also because, I live there and I know the scene. Maybe for an international audience, those resonances won't be communicated,
but I
curator. I make them do the hard work, and I just tell them when.
I think the other like opposite. I think that if you do highlight those local tendencies, you will bring in more people, because that's what it's like. That's what you have that others don't, and that's what makes Venice Venice. Like, you arrive and you can see, the local tendencies of anywhere in the world that has a pavilion in Venice, and that's what pulls you in, and somehow in this like sort of global world that we live in, the more you dilute your own local tendencies to make them international, the less interesting you become, because you're one of many, whereas when you do think of somebody like Meitha, for example, if I'm to speak of artists from my generation, she comes, or Ala Idris, for example, who takes khararif, which are mystical stories from the past that are very tied to our childhoods and the local scene, and then makes it contemporary through her artwork. It's very fascinating, because you get to know so many levels and so many. It becomes much more on the surface you can tie it to many things, but then once you dig deep, you have that depth that makes it like a piece of information that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get to.
That sounds like a proposal to me, don't you think, Melissa?
Seriously, well, we can
right there. It's all there.
No, I'll finish with one point, because I think we're supposed to go. But I was, as you were talking, I was thinking that, like, maybe that's just the the swings and roundabouts of narratives. Like, I think when I first arrived in the UAE in 2015, like what I heard from everyone was like, it's so international, and people who grew up here who are not Emirati are returning home, and kind of the narrative was that 90% of the population of Dubai is not from Dubai. People like you, Myrna, who aren't Emirati but are Emirati in a sense. And I wonder, and that Hamad Nasser's was very much kind of that, almost the acme of that generation of people who are like, we're not from here, but we are here, and what is Dubai for people who are not local? And maybe now there's just a shift backwards to thinking, what is the local? What have we forgotten? And then that's just how the life works,
Whatever it is, it's ours.
Absolutely.
Even for somebody like me, and I've been called a Laborati, Emirati, a non-Lab, I've been called so many things. It doesn't matter. It's still mine, because I was here and I was part of this and I saw it. So this local culture, whatever, it's shared. And so if we're going to talk about it, let's, because it belongs to all of us.
Yeah. I wanna add to that as well. I went to a school where I was the only Emirati for days, and my best friends from KG2 up until today is an American girl and a Palestinian Iraqi girl, and they are Emirati to me. Like, there's no, and I think the National Pavilion does that also. If you are expressing a voice that is tied to the UAE, then you are the UAE. you know.
Yeah.
There's definitely no separation for me. And just to clarify, just in case that was not clear, when I say local, I am local, Myrna is local, you, Melissa, are local. Just any active participant in the UAE is a part of what we are, you know.
Well, that's a really nice way, I think, a beautiful sentiment to end it on. So shall we say goodbye on our Zoom
now, thank
remote?
you.
We're only local to our living rooms now, really.